Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for the fourth session in our Diaspora Forum series, Neighbours in New and Old Worlds. My name is Tatiana Der Avedissian. I am a trustee and an advisor for the Armenian Institute. Tonight's discussion will be led by Nik Matheou, our newly appointed program director. We're very excited to have, or I am, shall I say, a fellow Cypriot joining the Armenian Institute. He is a social historian specializing in Armenian history and culture and an activist for social, political, and economic issues in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, especially supporting and raising awareness about the Kurdish freedom movement. For those of you that don't know us, the Armenian Institute is an arts and cultural organization dedicated to making Armenian culture and history a living experience through innovative programs, educational resources, workshops, lectures, exhibits, and performances. The Armenian Institute is proud to have one of the largest collections of Armenian books in Europe. We have a treasure trove of books about Armenia, Armenians, and their neighbors, old and new. We even have rare books in our collection that are not found in the Library of Congress or the British Library. In an endeavor to make our wonderful collection better known and accessible worldwide, we invite you to help us fund the ongoing cataloging and the software needed to put us on the map. So this evening, we will be providing a link, and we ask that you consider donating generously to help assist us in the proper care and sharing of this magnificent collection. The link will be available in the chat box, and it can also be accessed through our website and Facebook page. Some general housekeeping about this evening. This session will be streamed live and will also be available afterwards on our YouTube channel. If you prefer not to be visible, please turn off your camera. You are all muted, but you can ask your questions through the chat box and Facebook comments, which we are also monitoring. Over to you, Nik.
Thanks, Tatiana. And thank you everyone who's joining us both in the Zoom call and on Facebook on the live stream. I'm really excited to be starting my time at the Armenian Institute with this event. It's the first that I've been curating, and on topics that are really, really close to my heart, both as someone of Greek Cypriot heritage and a social historian of Armenia and an activist with the Kurdish freedom movement. All of this really sings to my heart, and I'm really glad that we can provide a venue for this discussion this evening. So the Diaspora Forum is part of a series of events that we're organizing at the Armenian Institute as part of a National Lottery Heritage Foundation project, which has a number of themes which you can find out about on our website, one of which is historic and present neighbours. So this event falls nicely within that strand. And explores the historic and present connections between the UK's Armenian, Cypriot and Kurdish diaspora communities, the traditions, the shared, as well as different experiences of migration and diaspora life in the UK, both between, but also, of course, within each of these communities, because these aren't three homogenous blocks. It's really diverse communities, both within themselves and between each other. The shared histories that we've all got resonate in interconnected traditions of food and music and dance, dress, family life, and more besides, including some shared social and political and economic issues that I hope we'll have time to get into as well. And for our panel this evening, we've got three great young community leaders from the Armenian, Cypriot and Kurdish diasporas. And I'll just introduce each of them before I start on with the discussion. So first, we've got Raphael Grigorian, who was born in London to a mixed Armenian Cypriot and Armenian Iranian household, and has been involved in the London Armenian community from a young age. Raphael is an economist at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and enjoys watching foreign cinema and going on walks and hikes. Then we have joining us Elif Sarican, an anthropologist trained at the LSE and a writer and political organizer. She's the co-chair of the Kurdish People's Assembly in the UK and an activist of the Kurdish women's movement, where she works on communicating the aims of the Women's Liberation Programme to a diverse international audience. And last but not least, we have Christos Tuton, who was born and raised in North London, like many of us joining on the panel this evening, and is the president of Neighbours, the World Federation of Young Diaspora Cypriots. Christos also works for the National Federation of Cypriots in the UK Cypriot community's representative body, and he studied philosophy, politics and economics at the University of York. So a really great panel. Thank you all for joining us. And I guess we'll just get into it. We've got a few discussion topics that we prepared, but as Tatiana said, we'll also be monitoring the chat in the Zoom and the comments in the Facebook. So if you have questions, please ask them and we'll try to bring those into the discussion. So just to start off, maybe each of the panelists, why don't you tell us a little bit about your specific background within the community that you come from and your experience of diaspora community life. Elif, why don't you start us off?
Hello, everyone. I just want to first start by thanking the Armenian Institute for organizing such an important and also exciting event. I think it speaks to many of our hearts, bringing especially this discussion together. So thank you very much for that. And also, before I answer the question, I want to remark on, the range of conversation that is possible in bringing these communities together. Obviously, we won't be able to even begin to cover what the range of conversation that is possible, precisely because it's vast. But hopefully this is the beginning of many, many more conversations and collaborations to come. So I was also born in North London, like many of us. And I grew up not as north as perhaps most people, but in Islington, as a part of the Kurdish community who migrated, particularly in the 90s, from Southeast Turkey. My parents are both from Southeast Turkey, of Alevi background. And I grew up in quite quite an expected, like, Alevi Kurdish way, where from a young age, I was initially forced to, but then enjoyed going to Bağlama, Saz classes and Kurdish folk dance and make, all of the culture things that you hate at first, but then you realize just how important it was that your parents forced you to do this. I grew up in that way and met with and had been going to the Kurdish Community Centre in Green Lanes since I was a child, to cultural events, and then eventually got involved in political organising, and therefore became more involved in more of like a formal capacity, from founding the Kurdistan Students' Union in the UK to working with the Kurdish Women's Movement, and now last year being elected as the co-chair of the Kurdish Assembly. That we have 8 local Kurdish assemblies across the UK and 6 community centres, 2 being in London, 1 in Dalston and 1 in Green Lanes. Also, I know we're going to get into this conversation, but my background is really also comes and is the connection between our communities is very much in the history and background of my diaspora experience. The way our community was able to found the Halkevi, for example, the People's House in Dalston, was also, a Cypriot was very integral to the bureaucracy and the foundation of that community centre, and the connection between our communities. I think one of the things, and hopefully we can discuss, is particularly when our communities were coming to this country as refugees and migrants initially, the solidarity was really there in a very beautiful and meaningful way. And over time, I think there's been a bit of a disconnect, but I can see the energy to certainly make those connections again.
Thanks so much, Elif. And yeah, I think that that history is something that would be really great to recover and to speak a bit about in this event. Raf, why don't you go next and tell us a bit about your background and your experience of growing up in a diaspora community here?
Sure. I'd just like to echo Elif's words. I think it's such an important event, and I'm really proud to be sharing the platform with you guys today. So I wasn't born in North London myself, although I've lived most of my life here. I was born in West London. The majority of the London Armenian community is in Ealing and sort of West London. That's where I was born. And I distinctly remember my school that I went to didn't really have many ethnic minorities. And apparently I was quite a shy child actually growing up, until the age of maybe 12, when we moved to North London, to Southgate specifically. And suddenly all my friends had the same names as my grandparents' friends. They've got a Yorgos or a Tarkan, all these different names. And apparently I came out of my shell. But I've really been involved in the Armenian community from a very young age. I was forced to go to Armenian school, and admittedly, I hated it. I really despised it, just singing about butterflies and learning these poems when I just wanted to play football, as any sort of 6 or 7-year-old wanted to. And I came to a deal with my parents when we moved to North London. I said, please, I don't want to go to Armenian school anymore. And they said, okay, we won't force you to if you take up another sort of Armenian community place. And they said, how about Scouts? Your cousin goes to Scouts. Go to the Armenian Hometmen Scouts. I said, okay, I don't know what that is, but sure thing. And so every Saturday, my mum would drive me for about 40 minutes from North London to West. And I was at Hometmen Scouts from the age of 11 until pretty recently, actually. And so the Armenian sort of identity was very key to my upbringing. And when I got to university, it's something I wanted to explore more. A lot of times people sort of shy away from what they've experienced when they're younger, but I just couldn't get enough. And I was involved in the SOAS Armenian Society. And even after leaving university, I've been involved in various organizations, and including some with the panelists as well. But I'm really excited to talk about our shared experiences and in the conversation to come.
Thanks so much, Raf. And again, last but not least, Christos, why don't you say a bit about your background?
Thank you. And thank you to the Armenian Institute for putting this event on. I think as the other speakers have said, it's such a fantastic opportunity to engage with multiple communities and really kind of delve into some of our experiences as members of the diaspora, but also share some of those things that make being somebody of part of the diaspora community so special. So I can already really see so many similarities with the experiences that Elif and Raf have described, and I think that goes to show kind of the depth of connections that the communities do have. But kind of a bit specifically about me. So my mum's Cypriot, my dad's English, so that kind of brought up so many different kind of identity questions throughout my childhood. But it was kind of so fantastic to have two backgrounds to be proud of. My experience of the Cypriot community in particular has been there since kind of the day I was born. My family's really been involved in the community for a long time. My grandparents both heavily involved. So my grandfather was the manager of the Cypriot Community Centre in Wood Green for about 30 years. And that's kind of probably the biggest focal point of the community in terms of like day-to-day, the number of people in and out of the door and stuff. So many different Cypriots of all backgrounds regularly attending the community centre. So I kind of grew up next to that and had that as a big part of my life. My grandmother as well, heavily involved in women's organisations and so many different kind of forms of activism as well. So kind of really inspiring to see how they came over from Cyprus in the 50s and really just kind of maintained and fought to maintain their identity and their heritage. So kind of that was really inspiring as a child. And I went to Greek school as a kid, and also my kind of Monday to Friday English school happened to be in probably the area of North London with the highest concentration of Cypriots anywhere outside of Cyprus. And I actually went to the same secondary school as Raf when he did move to North London. So that goes to show kind of how kind of deep-rooted the Cypriot community is there. Whether you're Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, Armenian Cypriot, there's such a strong presence in Southgate, North London. And I really took my own steps of involvement in the community in kind of in my late teens. So after finishing Greek school, I kind of had a couple of years where I just kind of engaged with Cypriot politics and culture, just kind of as an individual on my own or with my friends. But then in about 2014, I joined Neighbours, which is the global Cypriot youth organization for the diaspora. And kind of since then, I've just been much more heavily involved and really have loved kind of helping to organize events and being part of an organized community. And yeah, just as was said in the introduction, I loved it so much. I took on leadership positions as well. So that's my my background in my community.
Thanks so much, all three of you, and it's really nice to see these resonances come out already in some like really strong ways, including the experience of hating Greek school, or the early experiences that you have as a very young member of the diaspora community, and then this more long-term transition. So since you've all referenced it already, maybe for the next round, we can talk a little bit about how the community organizes itself. Elif already mentioned the structure of the assembly, and I know that the Kurdish People's Assembly is organized in quite a specific way compared to many diaspora organizations. Christos, your involvement in Neighbours, the Armenian community as well has some organizations that are either representative or claim to be representative. So maybe you could say a little bit about how the community organizes itself, and also as you've touched on, in diaspora, how does each community sort of preserve or maybe reimagine some of its traditions from the homeland, so to speak? So the food, the dancing, social occasions, festivals. And why don't we start this time with Raf?
I think it's a really interesting question. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of all the panelists or even the Armenian diaspora. I'm only one person and have had my own unique experience of living in London. And we know the Armenian community in the UK is not just London, of course, there's many Manchester and other parts of the country as well. But I found that, I guess because of our history as a people who have constantly had to flee or have been a minority pretty much everywhere they've lived, there's been a real desire to preserve culture, be it via dancing, food, and the language. And I think that that's really manifested itself in the different community organizations and the way that diaspora Armenians are brought up in the UK, where there's that strong desire to keep it alive and not to lose it. There's a pride that comes with knowing it, having an IAN at your surname. Even such a small example of watching films and looking at the credits for an IAN at the end is because that desire to feel like we're still here in a way. And in terms of community organizations, I've always thought there are more community organizations than Armenians in the UK. We like our organizations, but I've been quite impressed actually, because I think that there's such a vast array of different purposes they serve, from the cultural to the political to the social to the youth elements, in terms of their organization, even religious as well. And I felt I've been really impressed actually with the I can speak for the London Armenian community. I've been really impressed in how they preserved cultures and community, where a lot of the time, some places I've traveled, I mean, maybe some audience members will agree with, when I go on holiday, I tend to try and look for an Armenian site nearby. If there's a church or there's an Armenian house or something, to go to Belgium. And I've been really shocked and surprised that despite us being quite few in number in the UK, I think these might be outdated figures. I always hear the 10,000 number thrown around about how many Armenians there are here. It's really strong. They've really kept themselves going with 2 Armenian schools, 2 churches, a whole heap of different youth activities, football, dancing, yearly dances you can see with New Year's Eve, for instance. There's tons. There's really lots and lots that's going on. And it's interesting also, and this actually came to me later on in my life, because that's all I'd ever known for Armenian culture. It's what I'd experienced with the community of my family. So for me, listening to Tata, for instance, or Haruk Pambukjan was second nature. It's like, of course, this is what Armenian music is, this is what Armenian culture is. And then when I went to Armenia, so I went the first time, well, I think the year was 2000. I was only 4 years old or 5 years old. I didn't remember it that much. But I went again in 2014 with Hometmen as part of a jamboree. And I've gone into a few debates about this. I remember I was really annoyed actually when I was there that there was no Armenian music being played in clubs. It wasn't happening every single day, because you can imagine that my my identity in the UK had been one of, okay, I'm British, I'm not English, I've got an ethnic background, Armenian, and I'm proud of my Armenian roots, and I know the language, I know the dances. And somehow when I went to Yerevan, it was like it was missing. And I guess I'd seen some select videos of impromptu Armenian dances in Yerevan, and I imagined every day must be like this. What a bad what a bad expectation of mine, that I have to force all Armenians to live a certain way, or all Armenians in Armenia. So in terms of why I bring this up, because when you touched on the word imagined, I guess, traditions, Nik, and it's interesting to see the disconnect of what our culture is and what we perceive it always to be, and that's been passed down, and I probably will pass down as well, and how that might disconnect a bit from those people living in Armenia now, who might be quite cringed at that idea of listening to this music, saying, "Oh, are you my great uncle? Why are you listening to this?" But it's I'm really impressed with the different community organizations in the Armenian community, and I think each one serves a purpose, and it wouldn't be here if it didn't. I realize I've been rambling on quite a bit, so I'll pass over.
No, those are really important thoughts, and I think especially that tension of somehow feeling twice a stranger. You have your own identity here, and so you have your particular traditions and things that you want to connect to, and somehow going home, quote unquote, is the moment to really feel like you're fully that. And then there's these tensions. I think it's a really common experience. And Christos, maybe you want to talk a little bit more on this topic. So how does the Cypriot community organize itself, preserve or reimagine traditions?
So I think the first thing to note is that we're a huge community here in the UK, and there's just so many different organizations, different ways that the community has been organized over the years, and that diversity really adds so much to kind of the fabric of the Cypriot diaspora. So kind of a few examples. So we've got the kind of the main coordinating organization of the community is the National Federation of Cypriots in the UK, which has about 80 different member organizations that fall under its umbrella. So that kind of represents the vast majority of Cypriot organizations here. So whether that's refugee organizations, whether that's village associations, missing persons organizations, football leagues, sports teams, charities, even UK-based branches of the Cypriot political parties, student groups, professional organizations, and then regional ones in places like Manchester, Birmingham, Wales, Margate, where there are Cypriot communities. So there's just so many different kind of organizations that fall under the umbrella of the National Federation of Cypriots. And I think that's such an important part of the Cypriot community, that actually there's this really coordinated and united approach, especially because we have such a kind of large ongoing national problem. So a lot of these organizations across a wide range of areas decided that actually we want our community to have kind of one focused and coordinated voice, and that all happened kind of immediately after Turkey's invasion in 1974. So there was this realization that, well, we need to organize and we need to kind of unite our voice into one powerful body. So that's kind of like the main, that has like a huge cross section of the community involved. But then you've also got so many Greek schools up and down the country that kind of are mostly Cypriot students in there. Obviously Turkish schools too, with a lot of Cypriot students present as well. You've got the church, again, over 100 parishes across the UK. So people kind of really engaging with their religious background, and a lot of Cypriot media as well. So you have two large Cypriot newspapers, Bargiagi and Eleftheria. You have London Greek Radio, which pretty much every Cypriot has it set on one of the presets on their car radio dial. And then so many ways of kind of celebrating the background and kind of preserving those roots. And I think some of the noticeable kind of initiatives and kind of inventions that are unique to the community are things like festivals that take place at churches across the country. There's a May Day festival in Birmingham. There's a Cypriot wine festival in London as well. So a lot of different ways of both celebrating kind of the organic British Cypriot community culture, but also bringing elements of Cyprus over as well. So for example, like little workshops about Cypriot dances, or kind of different foods and tasting, and bringing wine over from Cyprus as well. So there's a lot of different kind of ways that the community has organized to kind of preserve and maintain that structure. And so I think the organization of the community has been vital to maintaining all of that. And kind of in terms of like reimagining and talking a bit about what Raf was saying about kind of some of those tensions between the British Cypriot community and maybe how Cypriots are over in Cyprus. I think there's a lot to be said of kind of, there's like in Cyprus wanting to kind of progress and advance their culture and draw in from kind of modern ideas from all over the world, whereas for diaspora Cypriots, it's actually kind of the opposite. Our daily lives are probably taking a lot of inspiration from everywhere else, but we want to preserve our Cypriot culture rather than kind of develop and progress it. So there's definitely a kind of feeling that, well, for us in the diaspora, culture is about preservation, whereas over in Cyprus, it's perhaps a bit more about kind of evolving naturally and kind of organically growing the Cypriot culture to be kind of relevant to the modern day. So quite a lot of different interesting tensions in that, which I think we'll probably get into a bit more as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot to get in there, but I think it would be really great to hear from Elif now about, especially with the different way that the Kurdish People's Assembly organises itself compared to others, but also, yeah, the preservation, the reimagining of traditions. So Elif, please.
I mean, it's been really interesting to hear what Christos and Raf have been saying. And again, I think a lot of like similarities certainly come to mind, but I think there's also something that is like quite fundamentally different in that the Kurdish people are the largest nation in the world without a state, and which is divided who are divided over 4 nation states in the Middle East, and therefore has a very huge diaspora all across, particularly Europe, but also all over the world. And, I think the diaspora in general, I think there was a transformation in the diaspora, particularly with the influence of the Kurdish freedom movement. And I think we see this particularly in the recognition that our culture, our language, our food, how we practice life itself is inherently political, because there is a force, there is a reality that is fundamentally opposed to our existence. And I think this has had a very foundational impact on the experiences, particularly of the diaspora, obviously to connect it to our topic and discussion here. As it stands, it's difficult to have a precise figure, particularly because of the colonial reality of the Kurdish nation in terms of the effects of colonialism on the Kurdish nation by virtue of it being divided into 4 nation states. It's very difficult to have a precise figure of and on how many Kurds are in the UK. The estimates are between 300 to 400,000, but it's difficult to, have a precise figure. I think the foundations of the Kurdish diaspora certainly particularly took example from the Cypriot diaspora as a diaspora that predates the Kurdish experience here. But there was quite a shift, particularly in the 2000s, in the way the Kurdish community organizes itself and in how it sees and understands a representative whether it's bodies, organizations, structures, and how it sees the necessary representation of the Kurdish community where we are. And I think, the way it started and some of the things that have been preserved, particularly like politically, before I get into the cultural aspect, is, aspects like community reconciliation. So the Kurdish community, since its arrival here in the UK, has had organized committees and attempts at maintaining and developing community peace and reconciliation in an attempt from the very beginning of its experience to be self-sufficient in terms of its internal community problems. Now, that transformed into, in terms of self-government, into the self-government of life itself, after there was a shift in the paradigm of the Kurdish freedom movement. And that's where the change or the formations of the Kurdish assemblies come into it. The Kurdish assemblies are formed of various different committees, from organizing and mobilizing the community to, self-organizing our own media, self-organizing our own culture and our own community events, our own internal education in terms of the history of our community and so on. So I think this is where the preservation of the community comes in a very heavy way, and this includes the cultural aspect as well. I think I think this is something we all share, that God knows that our communities miss a good dance at the moment, and it's been a deep tragedy. And this is one of the kind of, I guess, jokes that was made last year when Neighbours was cancelled. So since the 90s, Neighbours has become a resistance festival. The spring equinox has become a resistance festival in the way it was transformed and politicized by the Kurdish movement. And there was a joke last year saying no state, not even NATO, no enemy was able to ever make us cancel Neighbours, but the coronavirus did. And it seems like there aren't going to be mass festivals for it this March as well. So, and, it's because it became something more than just getting together and dancing and listening to great music. But it's a way of reminding ourselves that wherever we are together. We have a shared goal, which is a self-organized home, land, and how we organize ourselves, and particularly our revolutionary ideals. And this is also what the Kurdish community, the Kurdish assemblies are based on. So it's assemblies that self-organize based on committees that are that take care of various different areas of society and life and so on. And one of the central characters of the way we organize our assemblies is the autonomy of women. And I think this is the interesting aspect of the difference between the Kurdish diaspora, I think, which comes from a very specific and intentional influence by the Kurdish movement, is often the diaspora is a lot more conservative, precisely because of the things we've discussed in terms of the preservation aspect. But one of the programs of the Kurdish movement is to share the development of the community between the diaspora and the home. And I think this takes on a different mission, especially when obviously we don't have a recognized homeland in the way the Kurdish people live it. But this is the most important aspect, is the autonomy of women, and particularly also the autonomy of youth. And, when we talk about lots of different organizations, there are ones popping up in the last few years of various different Kurdish organizations. But one of the successes of the Kurdish assemblies is a way to make sure that different areas of work have autonomy and are able to do their own focused work, but are fundamentally coordinated with each other to make sure that the strength and the power of the community is one. And I think, this comes from the newspapers and the radios and the TV channels and so on that have popped up all across Europe as well. And they are always fundamentally coordinated. And this is the very central aspect of the paradigm of the Kurdish movement, is that it's autonomy, but it's not independence from each other. and also there's also been very crucial difficulties, and I think it's important to talk about the difficulties of our community in organizing itself, because most of the Kurdish community in London particularly are Kurds from Turkey, and Alevi Kurds from Turkey, which the Turkish state for over a century has had a very concerted effort at assimilation. And so this is one of the purposes the Kurdish Assembly and the Kurdish community centers have played, is to also undo the assimilation by a state that used every single resource at its disposal to rid these people of their identity and their background. So it hasn't been easy. We still are transforming this, and we still face the effects of assimilation on many aspects of our community. But I think especially through the music and the dance and the political awareness and so on, I think it's come a very, very long way.
Thank you, Elif. I'm actually going to chime in and say that Raf and Christos, as somebody who was born in London and raised in Cyprus, I can understand the difference in how you guys were raised versus how we were raised in Cyprus, because I never used to go to Greek clubs when I lived in Cyprus. You couldn't even take me to a bouzoukia night. And then suddenly I found myself living in the UK and dying to go bouzoukia. When I go to Cyprus, my friends look at me like I'm a weirdo. And Raf, I've been all over the world and I go everywhere looking for Armenian history. And the only place I didn't find it was South Africa. So, but I wanted to ask you all, because you've all touched on different things, and all three of you in your own right are somewhat leaders of youth movements and so on, whether it's in the Armenian community, Cypriot or Kurdish. What do you make of community leaders? Who are your community leaders? Do we need them? Do these communities need them? Or can these different communities be self-governed? Christos, I'll let you go first.
I think so. I think in our context as a Cypriot community, because we have such a crucial national issue, that we need to have a united and very clear voice and very clear positions on kind of the developments and the politics around that. I think it's so important to have somebody who acts as kind of a spokesperson or an organization like the Federation that really does coordinate all those different diverse aspects of the community. And although there's so much to be said for kind of having many different strong community organizations with many people speaking up and being very active, I think that the Cypriot community has really benefited over the years from having that kind of recognition that if we all pull in the same direction and kind of get behind like maybe the president of the National Federation of Cypriots or kind of other influential people in the community, then we are much stronger as a result of that. So I think in our context, we've really benefited from having that kind of coordinated approach.
Thank you. And Elif?
I mean, I think this is a really crucial question, particularly being in the UK, from like the late, 90s onwards. I mean, kind of before as well, but in like a concerted way, 19 onwards, there was an attempt by the then British governments to form and create these very apolitical community leaders, which supposedly represented the community, but they were in a very like intentional way, apolitical leaders that were like championed as representing people, but actually had no mandate. And I think this comes in a way from the difficulty that we see in Britain in general, in politics in general, that people who try to change something that have an issue with leadership. And I think this is why when we discuss leadership, we also often discuss it as though it's like mutually exclusive, like with like self-government. I think, and this is what the Kurdish, and this is, you know, what the Kurdish diaspora and the Kurdish movement perspective is that leadership and self-government mustn't necessarily be in synthesis. Not that they are just, you know, in a simple sense, not mutually exclusive and can possibly coexist, but they must necessarily be in synthesis. So there must be a political, social leadership that represents the community, but also there must be a self-government that one can hold that leadership to account, but also that is also leadership in waiting. And this is really crucial in terms of it's not about like one or two people, it's not even about bodies, you know, it's leadership isn't just about, oh, if you have 3 or 4, then it's democratic, but it's about making sure that one, the community is represented in a truly democratic way, not just in like what we see in, you know, representative democracy as we do here, but also in a way that leadership is necessarily focusing a very crucial part of its efforts to bring up new leadership. And that doesn't mean when new leadership comes along that the current leadership kind of like takes a step back in a way that, oh, you know, you take the responsibility, but it's a way that everyone eventually, the society and your community is so well organized in a self-governing way that everyone is a leader. But everyone is a leader understanding the true sense of responsibility. And I think we very too often come across leaders who are not responsible and who do not see themselves as accountable to their communities. And I don't just mean accountable in terms of decision making, I mean accountable in terms of political, social, and cultural values and principles. And this is really crucial as well. This is, you know, one of the programs of the Kurdish movement that, you know, centers women's liberation puts forward, is that it's not just about, you know, you come and there's a, you know, 60 or 70 person assembly that you're accountable to in terms of decision making, but there's a political and ideological responsibility that you understand that you are there not just to represent a number of people, but also some principles and alternative visions as well. So I think in that sense, leadership is absolutely necessary. I think leaderless communities are defenseless communities, but it's the character of the leadership is really crucial and very central to the use of that leadership as well. And, you know, in our case, there is, because the Kurdish community is so religiously diverse, there are autonomous, like religious belongings, aspects and parts of our society feel, but fundamentally the structure that is seen as representing the Kurdish community is a social and political one, and in our case is the Kurdish Assembly.
Thank you, Elif. And Rafa, I'll ask you as well. I mean, and I'll just sort of add to this that I think, to Elif's point, the Kurdish community is quite politically organized because of the nature of the situation that many of them find themselves in. And in Cyprus, there's a bit more of a directive that comes through the actual state from back home. I think Armenians as a diaspora are a little bit more distinct because of the fact that there is no directive that comes from the motherland, so to speak. And the church sometimes, you know, takes that role, or there's other entities. So what do you, like, as an Armenian, how do you feel about this? Do you have a community leader?
So I thought by being the last person to speak, I'd have enough time to think about it, and I don't have an answer. I'm debating this in my mind as well, because I think the community is so organic, where these different organizations are popping up for different needs, where you've got a dance group, a church group, a society group. So for instance, the whole reason I wanted to set up the SOAS Armenian Society and really do some good work with my friend in the UCL Armenian Society was because we didn't really see a youth-led cultural/political movement where we would engage with non-Armenians. So for instance, we were at university in 2015, so we had the centenary essentially, and we were wondering how best to market, and we decided we wanted to set up the organizations because we didn't see that there was a space for maybe our generation, our voice to be heard, our age. And we did some really great work, actually. I mean, we've got Jeffrey Robertson, Robert Fisk to come. We engaged with the Kurdish community, the Kurdish societies there, the Cypriot, the Turkish societies as well. I mean, so you would have seen from my introduction, the Armenian Institute posted about a Hrant Dink commemoration that we had established. And it was the first time ever in SOAS history that the Kurdish, Turkish and Armenian societies were doing an event with each other rather than against each other or shouting at each other. And it was really inspiring to see. And I felt that I had that motivation to set that up. And I presume my friend did as well, because we felt there was a gap there, and it was a gap that we could fill, and we had the power to. I'm trying to rack my brain now to think of one person, one individual or one organization representing it. And it's too vast. There are so many. And unlike the Cypriot organizations, the National Federation, in fact, I don't think there is this one central committee which handles everything. I think organically the Armenian community does quite well, actually. It's quite flexible and resilient. So for instance, for the centenary anniversary, I know there was a committee formed, a cross-party, I should say, from all the different Armenian political parties and different groups to try and unite, because we realized this was such a crucial and important thing to commemorate across the Armenian community. But it wasn't led by one person or one organization. As you mentioned, Tatiana, there's the Armenian representative in the Cypriot parliament, or even in Lebanon as well. There's that sort of the direct representative. And in the UK, of course, we're a small number. We won't have, but I don't think we've had any Armenian politicians before. We've never really had any political voice other than organizations such as ANC, for instance, who do some good work and do collaborate with different organizations. But again, I don't know. And I'm happy for anyone in the comments in the audience to write as well, and what your views are.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. Maybe friends who are joining us would like to write in the comments, so either on Facebook or in the Zoom chat, what their responses to these questions would be. So for the next topic then, you've all referenced in different ways some of the diversity within the respective communities and some of the different experiences that this entailed. Obviously, the Armenian diaspora has for so many centuries now been so vast and so diverse across the world, and that sort of 10,000 number, just assuming that's right at the moment, masks a lot of variety even within itself. And Raf, you mentioned your own household is from different areas. Elif also has mentioned, of course, Kurdistan is split between 4 different nation states, but also within each of those nation states, the various Kurdistans are also diverse in terms of dialect, in terms of Muslim and Alevi and Yazidi Kurds. And of course, Cyprus, while Cypriot isn't a strictly ethnic identity, although it has come and often by default it becomes a sort of Greek identity. Of course, Christos and Neighbours, you represent Cypriots from all communities. So I wonder if you could each speak a little bit more about this, a bit about some of this diversity, also maybe in terms of coming at different times. For example, in Cyprus, people who came before 74 and people who've come as refugees since 74. Christos, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think the time thing is a huge kind of difference between the diaspora experience. I mean, so Cypriots kind of first came to the UK in the 1930s, I believe. There were very few who came before that. And those people grew up, had children, and those children are now kind of in their 60s, 70s, 80s, but have British accents, but are kind of like, and that's so strange because then when you think about the fact that, well, actually the vast majority came in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're the same age as those ones who came slightly earlier, but just have a completely, there's like a kind of generation gap of how integrated they are and how they speak and how they act and stuff. So I think that's a big factor. And especially when you look at kind of the periods when Cypriots did come truly en masse, which is the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even those experiences are so diverse. So my grandparents both came in the 50s, escaping poverty and kind of the British oppression and some of the problems that were going on the island. Whereas people who perhaps stayed at that point might have had slightly better kind of life circumstances and had very different experiences in Cyprus to what my grandparents might have had, and therefore forced them to leave early. But then you see throughout the 60s and 70s people coming over because of there's a kind of looming tensions between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot community. Then you've got kind of people just kind of coming over for opportunity. They might have had British passports left over from the colonial era. And then you see mass movement of people after the invasion in 1974. So as a result of the invasion, there's about 200 to 250,000 Cypriot refugees of all communities. Many of those people kind of stayed in Cyprus, but thousands, tens of thousands left with the hope that they would one day go back, and that never happened because their villages or towns were now under occupation. And I think in Haringey alone, there were like all of a sudden this influx of about 11,000 Cypriot refugees just into that one borough of London. So you've got huge kind of numbers of people coming over with various different reasons for why they came, and that obviously really impacts the experience a lot. And so I think something that's probably kind of similar for all of those Cypriot migrants is that they expected to go home back to Cyprus not long after arriving in the UK. And although that was true for some, the vast majority have stayed and had children and grandchildren here. So I think that kind of why you came, when you came, is obviously kind of a big factor that changes experience. But I think something that's important to note as well is how the people who were here earlier embraced those who came over later. So for example, if people came over as refugees, then the community quite quickly set up housing and jobs and things to provide for those people. Whereas those who came over much earlier had to kind of fend for themselves and didn't have like a network to go to and rely on. So for example, a very common way of coming over was to travel through Europe and arrive at Victoria Station on a train from mainland Europe after traveling across from Cyprus. And you'd have Cypriots already here who would go down every day, wait at the station, walk up and down the platform saying, have you come from Cyprus? Have you come from Cyprus? And if they had, and many, they would say to them, look, come and stay here. I know somebody who's got a spare room, and they would help them kind of find their feet in the first instances. So there was a huge amount of community support and kind of teamwork going on back then. And then that's probably changed over the years as people have become a bit more kind of settled in their lives and in their professions. And now you kind of, your community is kind of based on who you interact with and stuff, more than it is about the necessity of kind of staying alive, having somewhere to stay, having food to eat, kind of thing. So that's changed a lot. And then again, I mean, I think talking about kind of the different communities of Cyprus, I mean, I think that Greek and Turkish Cypriots came over here for very similar reasons, either to escape poverty or because they were Turkey's invasion changed their situation. So you actually, I think I was reading something, there's more Turkish Cypriots in London than there are in Cyprus. And I mean, that just goes to show kind of how the diaspora has changed to kind of not even reflect the situation in Cyprus anymore, because now in the occupied area of Cyprus, there's so many settlers that outnumber the Turkish Cypriot population there. So that experience is just completely different. And I mean, I think kind of over time, there's been, I mean, I would say that at various points, the communities have had kind of better and worse relationships, but throughout history, as long as anyone can remember, they coexisted and lived in the same villages or interacted with each other at markets, whether that was in Cyprus or whether that was here on Green Lanes. I mean, if you look at kind of the if you look at like references to Green Lanes in the Houses of Parliament, I can assure you that the majority of them are probably about Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities living side by side with each other. So although they have a different kind of language, different religion perhaps, there really is a shared kind of diaspora experience in many ways, and they found themselves moving from Cyprus, where the communities live together, to come into the UK, where the communities live together. So I mean, just as a personal example, my grandparents lived in towns and villages in Cyprus where there was a mixture of Greek and Turkish Cypriot community, but and then they came over here and it was the same. So I mean, personally, I grew up with my godparents living next door to me on one side, directly next door, and on the other side, a Turkish Cypriot family. I mean, that couldn't be more like Cyprus was many decades ago.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's, I mean, that story about the going to Victoria Station, I hadn't heard stories like that. That's really beautiful to hear that kind of community solidarity. And my bapu also came on the ship and got the train into Victoria a lot earlier. But in what you were saying at the end there, I think it's good to hear, because I always heard from him that when he first moved over, he had lots of Turkish Cypriot Gumbari, lots of good, really close friends. In fact, some of his closest friends were Turkish Cypriots. But you hear fewer Turkish names, or I heard fewer Turkish names in the stories as he sort of they moved from East London up to North London and Barnet. But yeah, it's still in lots of North London is living very close to each other. And I think another really interesting thing you brought up there is also this term refugee, which obviously a lot of people in all three communities could claim or relate to in different ways, whether that's the immediate result of invasion, or villages being cleared in the case of the Cypriot or Kurdish communities, or the long-term experience of the genocide. Yeah, so I wonder if that's another thing. How do these different communities relate to this term refugee? Maybe Raf, you want to come in here and talk a bit about the different experiences in the Armenian community and how refugee is understood as a status.
I think it's a really good question, and it's one that got me thinking, because technically, I guess, my dad was a refugee. So my dad is Iranian Armenian, and he fled just during the war. There was a big drafting process. He goes, I'm not going to go fight in this war. And he fled via Turkey to Germany. A lot of his family made the same journey. A lot of Iranian Armenians actually go to Austria, Germany, and from there either to Los Angeles or to London. My dad came to London. But it's interesting that I'd never used the term refugee for him. And I don't think I've heard him use the word refugee for himself either. And I don't know why I don't know if that's because of a connotation that refugee has, especially in the modern age, where you associate with a certain type of person from a certain type of the world, from a certain part of the world. Because we've definitely used the term, as you said, to describe the genocide and our ancestors being refugees and going through Deir Zor and the deserts. But that modern impact, and even with migration from Armenians from Armenia itself, I've never really heard the term refugee. That might just be my personal experience, and I don't want to talk about and claim to represent everyone else's. But I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point from my side, especially. Thinking about how there are many differences between the communities. I know that whilst Armenians have been in the UK, Manchester, for centuries or so, the ones that came to London were predominantly Western Armenian speakers at first. Of course, those who fled to genocide. And then I think, as my dad did, for instance, late 70s, 80s, when Iranian Armenians would come. And it's an interesting mix. And I want to stress that I thought the communities did a really good job in actually holding everyone together. So rather than seeing ghettoization of certain communities, because it's so easy in human nature to do, you speak a certain way, have a certain food, London did the opposite. And in fact, the organizations brought people together where you could share the different foods. And for instance, it's funny that I have memories of Western Armenian families using specifically Iranian words because they'd learned it from their friends who are Iranian Armenian. I'm sure many have heard the same, like when you say masalan or yani. I mean, these are Arabic words originally, but they would, and of course the Lebanese Armenians from Syria use those in Arabic, from Arabic. But from my side, for instance, I learned that from my dad's side of the family, and I know friends who are background Western Armenian using these words because they get them from their friends. And it's interesting. I think the relationship between the Iranian Armenians and Western Armenian speakers, I'd say, in those sort of years were really conducive. And but then the new kid on the block arrived in the past few decades in terms of migration from Armenia, which has come in. And again, I think the community has done a good job. So I was involved in Homeland Scouts, and it was really interesting to see the difference in generation just through age. So I mean, we'd see photos and videos of predominantly, as I said, Eastern Armenian speakers from Iran, let's say, and West Armenian speakers in photos of my parents' generation in Scouts. And then I became a leader in Scouts, and I had my own, I guess, cohort or a group of kids. Most of them were from Armenia. Their parents were they were first generation immigrants, and they'd be speaking Armenian differently again. But then I'd start learning the words that they use, and I'd start using them as well. And I think it's quite a beautiful mix, actually. I mean, some of the words, like, I love them. I'm probably going to say them wrong, so I'm not going to say them now. But it's really interesting. It's really great. And sort of touching on the point that Christos and Nik were making. My great grandfather, this is from my mum's side now, who was Cypriot Armenian. He, like many other Cypriot Armenians and Cypriots, when he came to the UK, he's in North London. He had lots of friends who were Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, Armenian Cypriot. And at his funeral, a few years ago, maybe 6-7 years ago, I thought it was beautiful to see. So I remember sitting there at the church, and my idea of my great grandfather was an Armenian Cypriot. I'd heard names of his friends who were Turkish Cypriot and so, but I hadn't ever met them really. I mean, they'd visit his house, and then there I was at the church, and I saw a family with hijabs in a church for my great grandfather's funeral, and I thought that was beautiful. And it's because he maintained those friendships, and he really stayed true to, I guess, his Cypriot identity and Armenian identity there. And I thought it was lovely. And I think we're quite privileged that London has that effect, rather than in California, let's say, where different communities and groups are really miles and miles apart. You need a car to get anywhere close to them. London, we're all quite mixed, and most times, if you ask a kid if you know someone from a certain ethnic background, they know one or two people anyway from all over the world, because of, I guess, London. London's a melting pot, as cliche as it is. But the Armenian community it's been interesting with that mix and that generational shift, as well as we're seeing. I guess the makeup of the community change over the years.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that I found really nice is recently, oddly, through the Kurdish community, I've got to know quite a few more Turkish Cypriots than I actually grew up knowing, and especially some of the older ones. The way they speak is just like my uncles, and the dialect and everything is. You really feel connected, and there's an instinctive sense of family, and we have some shared heritage that any sort of category that you could put on it wouldn't ever really be able to capture. But Elif, maybe you can come in and speak a little bit about the diversity in the Kurdish community, and the different experiences there, and how people there relate to this to the experience of refugee, or however they term it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting to hear about the different experiences. I mean, I agree with you, Nick. Like, this is the first time I heard about the Victoria Station, stuff that Christos spoke about, and I think it's quite remarkable, actually. But also, kind of, in some ways, it's like that refugee, but also like diaspora experience. It's kind of like this very like innocent like display of it, of like, I'm just going to go to a station and like find my people. Like, do you know what I mean? There's this like innocence to it that I feel like is not so much there anymore. So yeah, it was very touching to hear that, actually. So thank you for bringing that up, Christos. I think the experience of the Kurdish community, but also, I guess, similar to everyone else who has spoken today, is that the refugee experience particularly is very much in line with the experiences that were happening back home. And when I say back home, I mean like all over Kurdistan, whether it's Turkey, Iran, Iraq, or Syria. And when you see the migration and refugee patterns, you can see, it's always connected to something that was happening, for example, particularly in the 90s, of the emptying of villages in Turkey by the Turkish state, but also like, before and after, but, also around the same time, the particular policies of the Turkish state towards Alevi regions, which was this very concerted and deliberate like underdevelopment economically, which people had no choice. People either migrated to Istanbul or to parts of Europe, as people do, migrating to metropoles to be able to get by. So, and also in other parts of North Kurdistan, in like southeast Turkey, of the emptying of villages, and in other parts, and therefore how that impacted people's patterns of becoming refugees. I think the experience here, I mean, there was particularly the Halkivir, which unfortunately is not the current Halkivir that exists. The former Halkivir was also in Dawson and Stoke Newington, but this very big building, this huge like listed building that was dubbed like the Kurdish embassy. Obviously Kurdistan is not a state, it has never been, but it was a place that every single Kurd who migrated to the UK, and it was almost always like London at the time, that's where they would go. You didn't even have to know anyone, but that's where you would go. And then the bureaucratic help, that aspect was quite organized in a community sense. The bureaucratic help of like finding where to stay and like where to, and if you somehow didn't have contact with family members or people from the same region as you, the contact was made, for a sense of community. And of course, the material aspect of it, of being able to get by, like in terms of jobs, there was contacts at the time. Most people worked in factories. So, factories and access to obviously your own food and so on. So this is how it was, particularly at the time. The community was a bit more concentrated in areas around Hackney and Stoke Newington, and the community has like moved more and more north over the decades, but at the time there was a bit more of a concentration in that sense. But I think the refugee experience has changed in terms of, well, actually, firstly, I think there was always a recognition that the move or the migration was a refugee migration, because of the reason they were leaving. So there was a recognition by the community that that they were refugees, and that we were refugees. Well, my parents were refugees, and often actually, because you were brought to wherever in Europe through essentially smugglers, and often people didn't really know where they were going to end up. So they'll be like, okay, you're leaving now, this is the day. So you could either end up in Germany, you could end up in London, you could end up in Paris. Like, it wasn't that often people didn't really plan where they ended up. They just knew they had to get out because there wasn't really a life that could be lived for various different reasons. But as people started coming in over the decades, the refugee experience changed in line with the change of the policies, in our case, of the UK government. At the time, the social state and housing and, and that kind of resources of the state were much more readily available to migrating and refugee communities. Obviously, as we see now, and particularly in the last 10 years, in terms of the austerity and so on, the refugee experience is very different. It's actually, in some ways, even though there's more of a community that you are immediately able to be a part of and therefore are confronted with, in a material sense, it's actually much more difficult. And I think we often don't recognize that people come and, in terms of like the experience of workers, you either come and you're already rich and, therefore the world is your oyster wherever you go, or you come and like the precarious working conditions, the policies of the state and so on. And it's a very isolating experience. So at the time, my mum would explain, they had to come here. My mum growing up could not speak Kurdish. If she did, her own school teacher would beat her. They weren't able to find any kind of like economic and political way to just live where they were. So they had to come, and it was difficult. But as someone who came, and she said, when they came here, and like some months later, I was born. And even though she didn't know that many people, she said, you were one of my only friends when you were born. And of course, the community like developed more and more and quite rapidly. In a material sense, it was not as difficult as it was now. And I think it's important to recognize this, because also the reasons why people are coming are not so different. People are still, after decades and in quite a devastating recognition, coming because of war, because of massacre, because of genocide attempts. And this hasn't really changed in terms of the reality of the Kurdish nation, but also, other nations, of course. But the experiences are very different here. But then again, obviously, there's a more established like community mechanism here that is able to navigate some aspects of those, but the material realities are very different. And I think, I think the experiences now in the last, I would say like about a decade, has been obviously mostly Kurds from northern Syria, from Rojava, and a lot of them, even during the pandemic right now, are in very horrible conditions in like detention camps and refugee and detention camps. So I would say that's probably, that's definitely something to recognize and raise awareness about, is the situation of refugees, not just of our respective communities, but the situation of refugees in general. And I feel like in some ways, as people who are children of refugees and migrants, in some ways, I feel like we have a responsibility to people migrating full stop, refugees in general, wherever they're coming from in the world. And also, somehow think about ways we can in some ways, I don't know, have an impact on their material situations.
Thank you, Elif. I think actually you've tied this up really well. Before we move to Q&A, and I know that there's a few questions that have come through, I want to ask you guys one final question, and I ask if you can keep it short so that we can have some of the questions come through, so that you can answer some of the additional questions. Is how consciously does your community think of the others as neighbors, either in the old or new world? And do you see a route, do you think it's possible to bring these communities closer together, working towards common goals, whether it's social, political, or economic? Elif, you sort of alluded to the issue of the challenges facing a lot of people in the region, and we can see that in recent months what's happened in Armenia and Artsakh, and the refugee issue that's been created over there as well. So Christos, do you wanna take this first, and then Raf, and then Elif, and then we'll move to the Q&A.
So I think I'll speak to like the political aspect of kind of neighbours and solidarity, because I think that there's, I mean, just as a few examples, the National Federation of Cypriots, the Kurdish People's Assembly of Britain, and the Armenian National Committee of the UK, as well as an Egyptian diaspora organisation, have actually been working really closely over the last few months on a couple of specific issues. And one of those is raising concerns to the UK government about the ease at which the British and Turkish governments seem to have reached a free trade agreement. And obviously we all have concerns about some of Turkey's authoritarian and kind of illegal acts on a wide range of issues. So there's a real sense of kind of common struggle on that front. And then I think also, like as a kind of historical note, I think there's been like a real tradition, especially on like the Cypriot diaspora left, of solidarity with the Kurdish movement as well. And I think there's been a lot of people over the years who've kind of have worked really closely with the Kurdish community on a lot of issues. So I think there's a real tradition of that going back quite a long way. So I think there is a real sense that we all want to see our homeland neighborhood be better governed and be safer for our diaspora, but also the people who live in those countries.
I'll keep it quite brief. It's interesting because Armenians typically, even when they went to Cyprus as well, before the invasion, after, they've always been very close to the Greek Cypriot community, and they're a recognized community in Cyprus, and they've always been quite involved and sort of had a relationship with the Cypriot community. It's in regards to the Armenian community's relations with the Kurdish community. I think it's really interesting because first, traditionally, and I know people of my grandparents' generation as well have these feelings of there's a real hate there because there's no nuance between the Turkish authorities, Ottoman authorities that ordered the genocide, and the Kurdish tribes that were utilized as tools to conduct it. And there are so many nuances there. This is one of the projects I did in university. We called it the Schindler of the Ottoman Empire, talking about stories of the Kurds and Turks who saved Armenians, rather than focusing on everyone being bloodthirsty. And my own great grandfather, for instance, his name was Diran from Adana. He had Kurdish neighbors, and the Turkish, I guess, troops, gendarmerie came, and they said, no, yok bizimdir, bizim çocuğumuz, like this is our child. Gave him some money, and he fled. He didn't see his family again, but they saved him. And there are certain, actually, it's quite interesting that my grandfather owns an apartment in Cyprus, and he was renting it to a Kurdish family, and they couldn't pay their rent for a good few months. And he helped them along, eventually had to say, look, I really can't take this, it's been a year or so. And they said to him, and he said, just don't worry about the rest of the debt, just leave. And they said, why are you treating us like this? He goes, I'm paying off the debt because my father was saved by a Kurdish family. And he said, it's really important to know. And there's these beautiful stories that shine through. But for a lot of people who don't know these stories, it was very much a sort of Armenians, Kurds, Turks are the same sort of category. But that changed in the past decades, because there was a lot of cooperation between Armenians and Kurds, especially freedom fighters, who realized that both communities were facing the same hostilities, racism, persecution. So there's many photos and meetings and interesting histories there, interconnected histories, and now it's becoming, that nuance is actually releasing itself. And I used to wear a Kurdish badge a lot of the time and a bracelet, because I remember watching a Christopher Hitchens video, and he was talking about the fact he wears a badge all the time because he's solidarity with the largest people without a state. And when you hear about the things that HDP is doing, for instance, and the PKK, and when the HDP is really pushing for recognition of the genocide, they're saying the only way that Turkey will develop its democracy, its human rights, is appreciation for its history and all of its communities. And I get really proud when I see those sort of elements really manifest themselves. And I agree with Christos. I think there's great scope to work together to an extent, even small grassroots movements where we can try and push to make sure the grey wolf sign, which many of us have seen and despise, becomes synonymous with a Nazi salute, because it affects every single marginalized community in Turkey, and it's atrocious that it's still being used so brazenly.
Thanks, Raf. Elif.
I mean, I think, God, I mean, a lot has come up. I mean, I'm not gonna speak too much about what Raf just said, simply because I think he's spoken about it so well. One of the things I do want to just put on record is that particularly, well, in Turkey, in a parliamentary sense, the HDP is very dedicated to the recognition of the Armenian genocide, and will and has been and will continue, I can only imagine, to work on that. And I think this is really crucial, because one of the biggest compromises, as we've seen the development of the nation state, particularly, actually, and I think often we don't make this connection, and we don't have time to go into it into detail here, but after the 2000s, when the so-called global war on terror became an ideological pillar of the nation state, there was a concerted effort, which people often didn't make the connection, of breaking international solidarity, of communities, of struggles, of peoples, of societies with each other. And I think when we trace it, that's when we see, especially from the start of the 21st century, of the breaking of some ties, particularly from a diaspora perspective as well, but in general. But as Raf mentioned as well, particularly in the last decade, there's been a revival of that, and I think there's no secret there's no secret and no shame in recognizing the role that the Kurdish movement, particularly the PKK, played in a region that works for everyone, in a Middle East, in a West Asia, in a Mediterranean that works for all the peoples of the region. And this is why the Kurdish movement in the early 2000s, it changes paradigm to say, actually, we're not seeking independent Kurdistan, because the land that the Kurdish people historically live in, not only Kurdish people live there. There's Arabs who live there, there's Turks, there's Armenians, there's Assyrians, there's Syriacs, there's, many, many diverse Muslim communities and Christian communities and Yazidis and so on. So what's the point in creating yet another nation state when we see the nation state system as a whole has not worked for the region? So in its place, why don't we embrace the beautiful mosaic that is our region and make sure that we can all live together? And, we share many beautiful things. Today, we didn't really get the chance to speak about baklava and lahmacun and hellim and all of the beauties of our region, and the dance and the music and all of these aspects that we share, but also that we do in our own ways as well, in our own diverse ways. As in, we don't have to be the same to be able to live as neighbors, live together, live amongst one another, not just next to one another. And I think, the more we understand, actually, not even in a, I guess, pessimistic way, but there is a common force that sees all of us as an enemy, that sees us as an existential threat. The Turkish state sees the Kurdish people, and particularly the progressive Kurdish movement, as an existential threat to the fabric of the Turkish nation state. And I say the nation state because it's obviously not a threat to the Turkish people, but it is a threat to the state. Still, till this day, the biggest insult in Turkey is to call someone an Armenian. And this is, when we have demonstrations, sometimes one brave Turkish fascist will come along and then scream at us, calling us Armenian. And we're like, yeah, and what? It's just a bit random, so yeah, sure, okay. But, you know, when we, and, you know, there's this shared history and not just history, but we see the future. For example, the Turkish state is going, the expansionist, the neo-Ottoman policies that particularly Erdogan is carrying out, what they're doing in from the Eastern Mediterranean to Libya to obviously Rojava to all across the region. There's maps that you see on Turkish news that obviously it doesn't really translate to people who don't speak Turkish, because it's not really reported anywhere else, of Turkish maps that you know, encompass the whole of northern Syria all the way down to Kirkuk and, you know, many parts of the region. Because at the moment, one of the narratives that the Erdogan government is trying to put forward is that actually the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the agreement that was made with Western powers was a compromise Turkey had to make. Not that Turkey took the land of other peoples, but it was a compromise Turkey had to make. And one of the last decisions that was made by the Ottoman General Assembly, something called the Misak-i Milli, which, you know, is a map that claims that the modern the successor of the Ottoman Empire must be Turkey and must include, you know, the now modern, the now northern Syria and parts of Iraq and so on. This is being put out, and so we need to understand that there is a force that sees us as an existential obstacle and threat to these future expansionist efforts and policies. But also in the last 10 years, in the last few years as well, actually, another beautiful aspect that has happened is what the Rojava Revolution has been able to bring together. You know, the autonomous aspects of the self-organization. For example, there's an Armenian battalion that is a part of the Syrian Democratic Forces that believes in a free, democratic, women's liberationist and federal Syria that works for all the peoples of Syria. So I think in terms of our neighbors, just lastly, like, you know, anyone who's come to a Kurdish demonstration, I'm sure, you know, most people on this call have in some way in the last 30 years in London encountered a Kurdish demonstration somehow. If anyone, and I know particularly during the attempted invasion in October 2019, a lot of people turn up with like Armenian Cypriot flags and, like, you know, flags showing international solidarity. People are, I mean, I'm sure you can speak to this, but you're always welcomed with, like, you know, big smiles and like excitement, say, oh my God, you're here, we're going to do this together. So I think there's definitely a mandate, but also a lot of beautiful hope to be able to work together and create a region that works for all of our people.
Thank you so much there, Elif, and thank you to Christos and Raf as well for your answers. They're really, really great, and I hope that this is the beginning of lots of conversations, because as we're seeing, only getting to the Q&A now, there is so much to say, but we've got a few questions and some comments. So I'll just ask all of the questions together, and maybe we'll have one round for our panelists to choose one or a couple if they that they might want to ask to answer. So first, just a comment from Louise Colton, pointing out that the Armenian London community is actually really varied from its origin, with many arriving in the 40s via India. So really speaks to what Raf had been saying about, and that's obviously just one example. So really speaks to what Raf was saying about the quality that London has for diaspora communities. But for the questions, Steph Mangioglu has asked what our panelists' perspectives are on keeping culture alive the longer that time passes and the more generations that we have from that initial moment of migration. So is this really possible? What are the difficulties? We also obviously spoke already about some of the problems with trying to fossilize that culture. So maybe how do we keep it dynamic if that is something we want to do? We also have a question relatedly from Bedros Aslanyan, who asks, what's the future of our diaspora communities? Maybe this is the other side of the coin to that question. What's the future of these diaspora communities, these minorities in the UK, given the issues of the forces of assimilation here? Not just in the Turkish nation state, but all nation states have this assimilatory quality. So what's the future? Stephanie has also asked how we practice our culture in London. How do we do it? Do we do it regularly? What difficulties have we had practicing culture as a diaspora? And finally, a question from Elif Genç, I guess specifically to Elif. How have you dealt with the patriarchy issue while setting up the women's movement here in the UK? So there's a few questions there, and maybe each of our panelists can speak to one or more of them as a final closing round. And this time, why don't we start with Elif?
Yeah, I guess I'll address the patriarchy in our community question. I'm really glad that that question has been asked, because I think we need to be able to have frank, honest and open discussions about that reality, because it absolutely is a reality. I mean, the Kurdish movement has central to its program women's liberation, but that doesn't mean that there's a magic stick that has all of a sudden eliminated the patriarchal realities of our community. I mean, the way to deal with it, very crucially and importantly, is women's solidarity with each other, because the expectation is that the patriarchy in our communities will be uncomfortable with the formation of women's autonomous structures and mechanisms anyway. That is the expectation, and that will and does happen, and is not set to go away anytime soon. And the expectation isn't even necessarily for it to go away, but is to set up and cement mechanisms and structures that allow for that struggle to be in Kurdish we call it hevalti, so in a comradely way, in terms of women with each other particularly, and therefore through self-educating about the program and the paradigm of the Kurdish women's movement, and trusting each other as women, because this is the way, you know, when we see, for example, the victories of the Kurdish women in northern Syria and in other aspects that have been championed internationally in terms of the fight against ISIS, often what has been void from that narrative is the motivations of these women. So I think, I think the most important aspect of it in a short sense is women's solidarity with each other, because the expectation is that that fight will be long and hard, and we have no other option really to also enjoy that fight.
Thanks so much, Elif. And maybe Christos, why don't you go next? And if there was a question that, or if you.
So I think I'll take this really difficult question of the future. I mean, it's something that I grapple with on a daily basis. Like, what is it that young people should be setting up, and how do we approach these questions of how we preserve our kind of heritage, culture, identity going forwards, and through the generations, because that's the real challenge. As generations become more and more, the distance from your closest relative born in Cyprus or wherever it is, the more distance there is from that, the much harder it is to kind of relate and really understand your background. So I think the challenge is kind of two things. So you need, I think, to have community institutions and organizations that allow people who are interested to go and kind of experience the community, to if it's language that they want to learn, they can go and learn language. If it's dance that they want to learn, they can learn dance. And then also kind of just, I think, an education as well of if you do know you have Cypriot origin in my case, then be proud of that. Be proud to talk to your children about that. Kind of embrace it. It shouldn't be something that you have any kind of negative connotations about or anything like that. It should be something that you're proud of. And I think that as generations go by, there's increasingly a realization where you have to be, you don't have to be anything, but you can be proud to be British and proud to be Cypriot or whatever your background is. And that kind of makes you kind of accepting that and being comfortable with that kind of answers the question of whether you're assimilated or not, because you're somewhere in between. You're proud of both where you live, where you've grown up, but also of your heritage. I mean, the question is how do you do all of that? I mean, it's hard, and I think you have to expose people to, like for example, in the Cypriot diaspora, we're really conscious of exposing people to the island of Cyprus, taking people there to visit, taking young diaspora Cypriots to go and experience the culture, see the sights, learn about their island. So you kind of really engage and educate people. And I mean, I think another thing, kind of a mentality change, is also in terms of that people aren't going to be able to engage with their heritage in the way that their parents and grandparents did, in like such an all-encompassing way. Like many of them, like my grandparents, for example, live a predominantly Cypriot lifestyle just in London. People aren't going to be able to do that for generations to come. So it's just kind of an acceptance that maybe people will only engage with one aspect of their heritage, maybe language or dance or food or something, but that's fine. You don't have to be this kind of literally all singing, all dancing Cypriot. You can be just the dancing aspect, and you're celebrating your heritage and maintaining it. So I think that's really important. And also just to kind of be really open-minded about things like marriages with outside of the community. That doesn't necessarily mean that your heritage is gone because you've married outside of the community or anything like that. I think it's a responsibility on an individual to be an active member of their diaspora and stuff. So I mean, I'll leave it there. There's a lot that could be said, but
yeah, there's so much, and that was a really great answer, and I really agree. But we'll move on to our last panelist for the last answer. Raf, were there anything in those questions that struck you?
I'll answer the same question and tie it into the question about keeping culture alive and sort of the future of diasporas. Very difficult. I agree with Christos. And I remember one thing I used to get really confused about and ask my family, my mum, I said, well, why can't I speak Armenian very well, being born in London, but my cousins who are born in Cyprus, which isn't Armenia, can speak Armenian very well. And I know many families and many Armenian kids in Lebanon, for instance, speak Armenian beautifully. They speak really well. And I always just get confused. Why can I not speak it fluently? I can get by, I can speak up, but it's not something that comes very, very easily to me as it does with others. And I've realized that it's a mix of these communities don't necessarily have everyday schools. You're not going to do Monday, Friday Armenian school. My granddad went to Melkonyan in Cyprus, which is an Armenian school, every single day learning Armenian. That's why he spoke so well. And it's sad. It does sadden me to see as generations go by, we are losing the ability to speak Armenian fluently. And I mean, there's other aspects of culture, of course, but in the interest of time, I'll just focus on that because it's one of the most visible, or audible, I should say. But it is upsetting that language can disappear so quickly, especially when you're in a diaspora and you're in a different country. Sometimes, maybe due to racism, you don't want to be singled out as a person who has an accent or speaks differently. And there's an attempt at trying to distance yourself from that heritage or from that language. I actually know of a friend of mine from Los Angeles, who refused to speak Armenian, as did her family, because they didn't want to have an accent when they spoke English, which is it's quite sad. And I kept saying it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can speak both without accents. It's linguistics. But I think, to be honest, my answer, I think, is community. It's a community organization. So because there are many people who are older than me who lost touch with their Armenian roots, their heritage, and they tried to reclaim it in their 30s or so. And they were able to, because there's a strong community. They're able to go to Armenian classes, they're able to go to Armenian dinners or so. But what if that community dies and people from my generation, 20 years time, who weren't able to really get involved in the community, now have a vacant community and have no one to go to? And I think there's such an important space for places like the Armenian Institute, all the different Armenian organizations that focus on culture, preserving our heritage as well, to allow those people who want to reconnect, I should say, and those who are born into the diaspora, really to keep it as live as much as they can. I mean, I'm going to try and speak Armenian to my kids. I hope they would too, but it definitely won't be of any fluidity. But I mean, at least trying makes a difference, and having those strong community institutions are second to none.
Thanks, Raf. And just to sort of plug Armenian Institute here, we do teach Western and Eastern classes, and we've just introduced an Ancient Armenian Studies class as well. So, feel free to join our classes, or one day soon, hopefully we'll welcome you to our new premises on Saffron Hill. I just want to sort of address Sarah's comment. Unfortunately, we're out of time for comments, but I highly recommend you check out a band called Collective Metz Bazar, because they sing in all languages and they're pretty fun. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Nik, over to you. I think we're going to close now.
Yes, so we'll come to a close. That's great. They're already friends. So yes, they sing in Kurdish and Turkish and Armenian and French and English and everything. Well, yes, so thank you so much to our panelists for this Diaspora Forum. It really brought out so many of the internal diversity, as well as the resonances and shared heritages and shared dynamics and shared experiences between all of our communities. So Christos, Elif, and Raf, thank you so much. For the people who are visiting us tonight, who have joined us for this event, please do fill out the feedback form, which is being put into the chat now. We would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, so that we can keep improving and keep putting on events that you find interesting. On February 13th, which is not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday after, we've got our next event, which is for Paragantan, Armenian Mardi Gras, which will be a masked ball and a fundraiser. So it'll be should be a really lively and fun evening with lots of dance, still through Zoom, but a way of connecting and celebrating nonetheless. So thank you everyone for coming, and I guess the only thing left to say is good night. So good night, Galinichta, Barikisher, Shev Bash. See you all soon.
Shev Bash.